Hello, everybody. Good morning to those who are here in person and to those who are online. Sound is what? Yeah, is that okay? Do you want to check a different? Yeah, good, great, thank you. We just checked the audio in the room. I'm very happy to welcome today Paul Kearney, who is a colleague who's actually been here several times before. Now it's the third time. The second in person. Paul started in 2018 as basically you were our first trainer in our evidence-informed policy trainings back then with the Global Governance Academy. And in 2022 in December, he was part of our workshop that we organized together with the European Parliament on evidence in times of crisis. Paul is professor of politics and public policy at the University of Stirling and a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. And among many, many other roles, he also has been special advisor to the Scottish Parliament and gave evidence to the Scottish, the Welsh and the Northern Irish assemblies or parliaments. His research focus is rooted in theory, practice and politics of public policy, evidence-informed policy making, but also policy theory and their methods that informed also the work that he's presenting here today. He works extensively on the UK and the devolved policy making within the UK, so within the 4 different constituent parts of the United Kingdom, and has a research focus in terms of policy on health and environment that he worked on in different projects. I actually was introduced to his work and to himself in a project that we did together for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Back in, I think it was 2016-17, with the first report for the JRC's Enlightenment 2.0 project, where Paul injected a lot of his expertise on evidence-informed policymaking in the first report, understanding our political nature. Today, Paul will talk about his research on the UK's the UK government's policy reaction to COVID, embedding that in policy theory and methodological reflections, not only about what the policy reply and responses was, but also how we as political scientists can analyze that in a meaningful way as to understand whether analysis over time can contribute as much as across different constituencies and political systems to the understanding of how governments adapted their science advice systems and exploited and used their science advice systems in COVID. With that, over to you. Very happy to have you again here, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. So can everyone hear me okay? Is that okay? I tend to mumble, so we'll see how it goes. I just saw this quotation this week that was apparently by Professor Mackenzie, a late Professor Mackenzie, and it was along the lines of academic papers should not have a conclusion. They should be open-ended so that people can contest the conclusion or think about it from themselves. So bear that in mind when you come to the end of this presentation, because I think COVID, it's strange. So when I became quite obsessed with the UK process back in early 2020. And at the time, a lot of the focus was on this is a game-changing experience. Nothing will be the same again. There's new normal, that sort of thing. But I think 3 years later, I'm thinking very differently about that. Things have gotten back to normal very quickly. That there was a very particular point in time that happened in early 2020, and so things change over time. So that's where we are. So I guess I'm going to describe 4 phases of UK policy, and you can see if they're the same in other places. But I'm guessing that we're into this 4th phase, which the Prime Minister, well, the former Prime Minister of in the UK called living with COVID or something like that. So I guess we're in that phase, but who knows what phase will be in the future. So that's what we're talking about today. What is it about the early 2020? What happened there? But also, how does it compare with phases since that? Okay, so I think these are prompts to myself. You want to start with a thing to explain and link it to concepts that people care about. So I think, yes, early 2020, the UK was one of many countries where their most senior leaders talked about being guided by the science or led by the science or something like that. I've never heard the phrase "the science" used more by politicians since that year. But in the UK, what they really meant was our scientists. So when the Prime Minister and the Health Minister and that sort of thing talked about guided by the science, they meant two people in particular, Chief Science Advisor and Chief Medical Officer. And they formed very strong personal relationships with those people throughout that period. And in fact, when prompted by others, when they were confronted with advice from other people, often senior ministers would say, well, I take my advice from the chief scientific advisor, not this other person. And so see what you think of this, but at least in that period, COVID-19 policies by UK ministers were highly consistent with the evidence or advice from these scientific advisors. So we can reflect on what that means if the science advisors were highly influential or if they were telling ministers what they wanted to know. But certainly their policies were very consistent at that time. Then over time, ministers diverged more from this advice. And I think that began, I think I can go into the details, but I think that began from, autumn 2020. And at the same time, those senior advisors sought much greater professional distance from ministers. They always used phrases that meant that, we provide them with evidence and they make decisions. But I think from autumn 2020, you could see they meant it much more, much more invested in putting distance between themselves and ministers, just as ministers were putting distance between themselves and their advice. And then over time, policy was based much more explicitly on economic and social issues. So it always was based on those issues, but I think ministers more and more made their decisions explicitly based on those issues, whereas in the past they were drawing on the authority of scientists. Okay, so I think that's basically what I'm looking to describe and explain throughout this period. Okay, and then I suppose as soon as you leave the UK, you assume that people are not particularly interested in the UK. So I'm looking for things, more general things to interest you with. Maybe you are. If you are and you're fixated with the UK, let me know and that'll be easier. But I think we would start with the most general sort of concepts in policy studies, I think, would be how this relates to bounded rationality and policymaking complexity. So usually I think the story here is that, at least from there's a sort of UK story of these concepts. And I think the UK story of bounded rationality is that ministers are responsible for everything that goes on in their departments, but they can only pay attention to a tiny proportion of the responsibility, and they have to delegate attention and responsibility to other people. They also engage in a policy process that is too complex for them to understand, far less control. And so their impact on policy is a small proportion of what happens. So that's, I think, there's a sort of UK story of these concepts, which suggests that there are two competing stories that go on in UK politics. One is the Westminster model, which suggests that power is concentrated in the centre, in the hands of a very small number of senior ministers. And I think then there's a kind of complexity story or complex government story, which suggests that their action takes place in this much wider system over which they have minimal control. So it's one of those, I don't know if this is the right phrase, but it's an overused phrase, but the UK can look quite Janus-faced. I don't know if that's I Googled Janus-faced recently just to check that this is what it meant, but it can mean duplicitous, can't it? But I think it just means you can look at it two ways. There's two sides of a coin, maybe something like that. On the one side, you have this story of a small number of ministers in control. On the other side, you have an argument that they're a very small part of a UK policymaking story. And I think the latter is what I'm used to. I take for granted this sort of policy study story, which is that ministers don't really matter as much as it looks. But you can't ignore the Westminster story because there's such a, that most people pay attention to that. And that is how ministers justify what they do with reference to the story. They can't really say, a press conference, you know, I'm part of a complex system over which I have minimal control and I don't really understand it. Or you imagine them trying to seek office. Well, if I'm elected, I'll pay attention to a tiny proportion of my responsibilities and try and do something about any of them. Even though when ministers retire and they reflect, almost all of them seem to say, okay, my advice to the next one is pick one issue and see it through, and maybe you'll have success in one issue or something like that. So they do admit these things once they've finished. Okay, but I think the issue with COVID is that regardless of how powerful they were, a huge amount of focus was on senior ministers at the heart of a COVID-19 response, particularly in early 2020 when they used to have these regular announcements. So the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson at the time, would make direct announcements on TV, or he would be part of press conferences flanked by, you know, two senior advisors. So it's very clearly that they were the public face of the response. And therefore, there was a high focus on how experts would work with ministers throughout that response. And I suppose I've never seen so many potential experts on Twitter and other social media essentially complaining that they are more expert than the people who are giving them advice. You know, so it is a sort of a very kind of lively thing to focus on. Okay, so it leads to a couple of questions. I think the first question is, why did some experts win and others lose? Maybe that's not the right language, but I think that's the language of interest groups that we talk about. You know, some groups win, have influence, some don't. And so I think there is a lot to be said for comparing the functions or dynamics of policy communities between civil servants and interest groups, comparing that to civil servants and experts. And so I plan to use the same language. Okay, so just been signed out of Zoom. Is that a problem, do you think?
As an expert as you are. It doesn't take okay.
Tuned. So I don't know, it's just in case people have been kicked out or anything.
I'm still in.
You're still in. Okay, participants are still there.
Could you try and move the slides forward or backward?
Okay. Yeah, it's still okay.
It still works.
All right. All right. Okay. Okay, so experts like interest groups. And I think there are two aspects within that. Actually, the first aspect is more, I was doing this comparative work with Federico Toth at Bologna. And so we're comparing UK and Italy experiences. And I think the higher low profile question seemed more relevant to Italy, but it was still an issue in the UK in terms of the interest group question is, do interest groups want to seek a higher low profile? And I think usually at least in the classic studies, the suggestion was, if they were already ensconced with the policymaking system, they already had good relationships with ministers and civil servants, then they would seek a low profile because they were doing things relatively behind closed doors. If they had less influence or they wanted more membership, they would seek a high profile to generate attention and seek influence that way. But the second part is what I'm more interested in, which is essentially almost anyone in the UK system can be an insider of some sort, because the UK government consults it. Grant Jordan and colleagues used to have this phrase about a trawling exercise. I guess it's like a fish trawler, where they would put out a consultation exercise. Anyone could reply, and therefore anyone is an insider. Okay, so if insider means so much, it means very little. So then we go into categories of what it means to be a proper insider. So they would talk about core, specialist, and peripheral. So peripheral are the ones that are consulted in some way, but really not influential. Specialists are consulted on niche issues as interest groups, or in this case, as experts. And core are consulted on a range of issues, so they're sort of called upon routinely. So that's the distinction that I'll be looking at. And then there are outsider groups who are outsider by strategy or by beliefs. Okay, so their beliefs are so incompatible with government that they wouldn't talk to them. Or they're too critical of government to be invited in to talk to them. So I think that's the interest group comparison that we can apply to experts. So in terms of interest groups, what influences their insider status? Or they have a commitment to support a government policy, or at least its legitimacy to make it, and perhaps the way that government defines a policy problem. So I think the more in which they invest in government legitimacy and framing, the more insider they may be. But they also have to possess resources that the government finds important, so they can represent a particular large group. Are they important to the economy or society, or they're essential to policy delivery? And they follow the so-called rules of the game. So I don't know, that could be sometimes that is an interesting thing that unites people in terms of concept. So I think if you were Mark Beaver, I've listened to a few Mark Beaver talks where he essentially says, don't use the word rules and don't use the word institutions because they don't exist and it just reifies them. So you call them practices or something like that. I'll call them rules just now, the rules of the game that groups tend to have to follow. And in the classic UK studies, this would be, define a problem narrowly in a particular way, and that limits participation to a small number of groups. But then the rest of the rules are about behavior. So keep your debates in-house, present modest demands. If you lose one time, accept it and you might win the next time, and don't criticize the outcomes in public. So I think some parts of that are British in terms of UK government, a tendency towards secrecy and to punish people who are too critical of their outcomes from the outside. Okay, so I think in terms of applying that to experts, there are two modifications you might make. The first is that some of these experts are also civil servants. So they would follow civil service routes, so that's civil service rules. That's a code of conduct, for example. And it's so that there are formal rules that they have to follow, but I think there are studies about UK civil servants, about the informal rules that they follow about, politeness. And I mean, I guess I sort of embody them. Yeah, they're kind of British rules, but essentially, you don't, I think Rod Rhodes talks about, don't display anger in a meeting, find other ways to undermine your colleagues than directly, that sort of thing. And the second thing is that I think, so in terms of the work that we did with the European Commission, that sort of thing, I think for years I kept going to these workshops in the European Commission and other places, and there would be such a fixation with the rules of science advice that we should come up with. And yeah, it'd be about everything should be transparent so that everyone's accountable. There should be, a dissemination of all the information that people use so that you can have open and critical debate. Science advisors should be independent from government so they can keep a critical distance and that sort of thing. And I always remember thinking there that those rules are almost in direct contradiction to the rules within UK government. So if you followed the rules of science advice you heard about at this level, I think you would have very little luck in being influential within the UK government, because you would essentially be excluded for not being seen as trustworthy. Like, if you follow good science advice rules about being critical of government policy, about distributing information, there's no way you're getting invited back to UK government. And so it is an interesting question about the extent to which people know that these rules exist. Because most of them are informal. And there was a great quote again by Beaver and Rhodes I saw recently about if political scientists know these rules, they really should write them down so that other scientists are aware of them, or something like that. So I feel like they're quite well known, and I would know which rules to follow, but I don't think scientists in most cases know that if they perform what they think are part of their training, it actually undermines them within government. So those rules and those resources add up to, these categories in terms of COVID-19. The core insiders were civil servants, chief science advisor, chief medical officer, plus some deputy medical officers and a few other people. The specialist insiders tended to be members of the scientific, I keep forgetting what SAGE is, scientific something emergencies, advisory group for emergencies. Okay, so it was actually set up to deal with emergencies in other countries. I think this was the first time it was really called upon to deal with a pandemic within the UK. It used to be a place to give advice on responses elsewhere. And it was quite secretive, only in the past, it only published papers after the pandemic was over. So this was a difference, but SAGE had about 100 members. And I think that gives you a sense of the distinction in these roles. If you imagine 70 people attended SAGE meetings, usually on Zoom. So that is not, a huge, it's not influential discussion. That is contributing to a meeting at which the core insiders would then take it to ministers. Okay, so I think there is a difference there. Then you had peripheral insiders who are most other people. And lots of people wrote these articles for The Guardian and other places saying, I gave you this great advice and you ignored me. So it's that kind of person. And then you have outsiders like, I think the most prominent is independent SAGE. And I think if you listen to interviews by the chief science advisor, he wanted them not to call it independent SAGE because it sounds too much like SAGE, but I think they ignored him. It was this critical role where they essentially did everything that SAGE didn't. They published everything in advance. They had open Zoom meetings and all that sort of thing. And they were explicitly against not only the SAGE way of working, but the policies that came out of SAGE. So they were very much zero COVID sort of thing. Okay, so I think this is what if you try and put it in a table where the text is too small, this is what you come up with. So you have the 4 categories plus you have the low and high profile. So I think with the core insiders, they tended to work low profile, follow the rules of the game and operate behind the scenes, except when they were asked by ministers to be high profile. So they would go on BBC to explain policy, or they would flank ministers in press conferences. Then you had specialist insiders who again tended to work behind the scenes and gave TV and radio interviews, but it was with their personal views. Then you had peripheral insiders, relatively unaware of these rules, more likely to follow scientific rules or principles, and some had a high profile on social media, TV and radio. And then you had outsiders. Actually, I couldn't come up with a low profile outsider, but I think a colleague in our workshop suggests that if you published critical, articles in journals critical of government, that would be kind of low profile outsider. But the high profile outsiders were independent SAGE. Okay, so that's the first question. How are we doing for time? Okay, so question 2 is how did these roles change over time? And I think if you don't want to listen to the whole thing, I think the punchline is that I think the influence of core insiders declined over time, but that did not mean that the influence of other experts increased. I think it was a general decline across all expertise. Okay, so in terms of the role, there are variations by country. So I think there are now quite a lot of articles have come out in terms of country level experiences or comparative experiences, particularly in Western Europe. And they all tend to say there was a range of influence of insider scientists from high to moderate. But there were more interesting variations over time where in lots of countries, there was a high reliance on scientists in early 2020, but over time, less and less reliance on those scientists. I guess as uncertainty goes down, ambiguity goes down, and become more confident. And a more global outlook was that it took essentially over time, it took more cases of infection and more deaths to produce the same interventions. So in terms of lockdowns, there was lots of governments had quite sensitive lockdowns in early 2020, but then over time, it took more and more threat to produce the same measures. Okay, so that's a kind of general thing. So it's the same in the UK. So I think I would say there are 4 phases in the UK. The first phase is before the first lockdown, where you had high uncertainty, you had fairly low policymaker attention to the issue, and then it became, higher and moved towards more restrictive measures. And I think in each time I've been looking for what kind of advice were there most insider scientists giving them, and how consistent was that with government policy? So I think before, say up to mid-March, there was not a great clamor within core and specialist insiders for rapid and radical policy change. There might have been that kind of clamor from people outside. And there are lots of scientists on the outside who said, you should have acted much more quickly, and we told you this. But that's not the advice that we're getting from inside. And in fact, to give you an example, the first written piece of advice by the, within government, actually before SAGE was properly used, was to consider a ban on people coming from China to the UK to travel. And the advice from within government was that there's no point in doing this because it would be a draconian measure whose benefits would be minimal compared to the social and political cost or something like that. So I think that gives you a sense of, this wasn't scientists within government saying we've got to do all we can here to stop COVID and perform a zero COVID strategy. They were actually quite similar in their mindsets with ministers at the time. Okay, then you had so I think they contributed to this kind of definition of COVID-19, which was a sort of liberal democratic definition of how you deal with it. So very much the ministers and the advisors were saying, we can't eliminate COVID-19 without a vaccine. So we should protect the health service. We should find a way to shield the vulnerable. And this used to be common language in 2020, the R, you've got to keep the R below 1, which means, keep a steady transmission level. And they were very keen to avoid suppression measures that were too high, that would then cause a second wave of infection when they took them away. So I think they thought the idea was that if they have a too strict lockdown in the early days, as soon as you lift it, people will mix and it'll be worse next time. So focus on gradual measures to avoid panic, build up trust in government, and then find some kind of exit strategy to help the economy and keep people in education and don't overrun the health service. So I think, things that we're talking about at the time were distancing and then the development of testing and tracing. And I put masks in question marks. I don't think that was even on the horizon within the UK. And again, I don't know if you tracked the kind of mask debate with the WHO, that sort of thing, but the UK advisors were very much on the cautious wait and see for the evidence that masks work kind of thing, rather than, there were people who were much more preventive about these things. But again, ministers and their advisors were very much skeptical about the role of masks. Okay, so that was their definition. And I think that was their definition right up until this kind of enforced lockdown at the end of March. So that was the point at which you could identify these rapid and radical changes. So the most radical, I think, was the legislation they introduced towards the end of March, in which they essentially said that people could not go outside unless needed to exercise or do something essential. And I think, so this is debatable, but I think ministers moved slightly faster than their most trusted experts in terms of lockdown. So again, it wasn't that they reluctantly did it, again, ignoring their advice. It was the advice up to then was this gradual introduction of measures. And actually, I think went a little bit further. Okay. So I think the third phase is more difficult to pin down because there was such a mix of things that they did. But this was when they did things like they were looking to release lockdown from mid-May 2020. So they experimented with different things. For example, regional approaches in terms of infection rates. And you're keeping particular places in lockdown. Or sectoral approaches so that they could reopen schools while they kept bars closed or something like that. So this is when I think there was more divergence in terms of economic and social issues. So ministers were keener on reopening than their advisors. But I think that was because of the approach that their advisors took was essentially, we need evidence of something. So they were reluctant to lock down because there wasn't evidence on that was better than doing, individual measures. And equally, they needed evidence that releasing lockdown would be a good idea. So I think that's the difference in both cases. But the thing to bear in mind here is that in the UK, at least, in the 7 months, if you look at the 7 months from March to autumn 2020. And you compare that with the number of deaths from October 2020 for the next 7 months, they were double in the second period. So this is actually there was a UK second peak, and it was much higher than the first peak. Despite the kind of UK rhetoric about not going too hard and too fast. Okay, so this I think this phase 3, it's probably the lesser studied part of the pandemic so far, but it is the most sort of devastating part compared to the first phase. And then you have the fourth phase, living with COVID. So that was after the vaccination program was a success. If you remember Boris Johnson back in the day, he announced lifting restrictions. And I think the phrase he used was, if we don't do it now, when will we do it? Or something. If not now, then when? Or something like that. And so he announced lifting restrictions, including mask wearing by spring 2022. By then, he was not flanked by his advisors, and he was not looking to rely on their authority, I think, very much anymore. Okay, so they were still, performing, advice-giving sessions and that sort of thing. But I think by this phrase, they were much more confident about going on their own. But again, it wasn't that other experts were giving them other advice. There are some people have gone from peripheral to core. This was just a general assertion of their responsibilities. Okay, so there you go. What's the thing to explain? So I think the first things to explain are, why did they rely on a small number of experts in the beginning? Why did they diverge from this advice over time? And why did they go from being guided by the science to being guided by the economy and social issues? Okay, and as I suggested, I'm not going to give you an answer to those things. I'm just going to raise them as interesting things that we could talk about. Okay. Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much. Just and thank you very much, Paul. Just for the proceedings, we open now for Q&A. Those online, please either raise your hand to ask the question directly or put it in the chat so that I can read it out loud. First reactions from the floor. David.
So you spoke of science as if that means something. And scientists, that's a particular category of person. And I found that very unspecific. And you spoke of experts in the same way. And so I would pose this maybe in a very specific way. What is the science behind allowing people to shop for groceries during lockdowns? So you said they followed the science. What is the science that underlies that, would be my question for you. Follow up, but I'd like to hear your answer to that first.
Okay. So, yeah, okay. So when I say ministers use the phrase guided by the science, I'm talking about their language, not mine. So it's them that aren't defining who the experts are. But they were relying very much on biomedical experts. They were listening to medics more than public health. They were listening to modelers more than other people. Okay. Is that enough for your follow-up?
Well, I specifically raised the issue of allowing people to shop for food. Because the policy was that during lockdowns, people were still allowed to shop for food. Also, part of the policy allowed truck drivers to deliver the food to grocery stores. The reasons for this are transparently obvious, right? Because only an idiot would have done it any other way. That's fine. But the point is that even these experts at some peripheral range of their expertise, they know nothing about grocery stores, about truck deliveries, about anything about that, about the importance of different economic sectors, about what causes people to thrive and to starve. These experts knew nothing about any of this. So there's a whole range of expertise that wasn't represented by medics, right? The whole range of science that wasn't represented by medics. So they could say that they were following the science, but they weren't doing anything of the sort. Right. They were following experts in areas where the experts that they were following had no expertise whatsoever. No medic knows a damn thing about grocery stores, that's for sure.
Yeah. But I mean, I suppose that's something that I would take for granted in what I was saying, that when they say, we're guided by the science, it's clearly a rhetorical device. So, I think if I'm repeating what they said, it's not that I think that these are the right scientists. I mean, interestingly, one of the things to track is that actually, in that stuff that we did with the European Commission, one of the things that people were talking about was that a good science advisor was someone who could form deep and wide networks of people so they could draw on lots of different things. So I think that's what they were trying to do with SAGE, you know, the 100 people and that sort of thing. But I think even the description of SAGE is quite narrow. So, I mean, obviously, there were no political scientists in SAGE, for example. There were no historians, I think. It was very much biomedical. There was a subgroup of behavioral and called behavioral science, but I think, just like any academic field, I think there were lots of people in behavioral science who would say they asked the wrong people in behavioral science and so on. So yes, there was a lot of that going on, and I think a lot of it would be to do with the people that chief science advisors had in terms of who they knew before the pandemic would guide who they spoke to after it. Yeah, and to be honest, I don't think they kept any of that. I don't think they said otherwise. I think they were very much trying to draw on people they knew quickly and they could trust quickly because they were looking for things overnight. So you could see that in some of the papers. You know, they were essentially saying to them, "What can you tell us by tomorrow?" And they were trying people they knew. Yeah. So I guess that came up as well with. I remember people like Robert Dingwall talking about this, saying that when it came to something like masks, you're relying on doctors who are obsessed with, well, fixated on droplets. It's all about droplets. When you speak to people who know about aerosol or something like that. Yeah, so there was a lot of that going on. I think, to be fair to the scientists involved, what they were saying at the time was, we don't know the impact of each individual measure. They actually, a lot of the SAGE documents essentially said that we don't know what all these measures will do. So let's do some of them, or let's introduce some of them gradually so that we can monitor their effects. And that was the UK government plan until about mid-March. But then, you know, ministers went for this complete lockdown after the rise in pandemic. So I think by then they had kind of given up on the sense that they would do a sort of trial and error, that they would, yeah.
So I have three, excuse me, three questions on my left-hand side, the others, and one online. So the others come in, yeah, when they feel they have a question. I would propose to go in the order of the circle, and maybe you can introduce yourself briefly so that we know who's speaking. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this should work. Hi, thank you very much for the talk. How do I introduce myself? I'm very interested in educational policy and research in general, and I'm a friend of Mira who works here. And my question was on whether there was any evidence or data about the influence of public opinion, whether it influenced in any way this progressive shift that happened between ministers and so scientists. Did you gather any data? And if so, I'd be interested to know more about that correlation. Thank you.
Okay, so I mean, other people were tracking public opinion. So I think, well, I think there are two things to say. One is that at the time of, you know, things like lockdown in March, the surveys that were done, most people supported it or thought that the, you know, ministers were not going hard enough or that sort of thing. And I think generally there was, they could draw on enough public opinion support for the things they were doing. And there was high trust in government at that time. Then I think over time, there was this, you know, a kind of split in public opinion in terms of a core group of people who were always going going ahead of government advice, and were critical of attempts to, you know, withdraw kind of lockdown measures compared to, you know, people who were critical of government for lockdown. So I think there was that developing divide. But I think over time, the bigger problem for governments in terms of trust was these other things that were happening that weren't to do with these measures. So the biggest sort of changes in government trust were to do with the behavior of particular people within government. So I don't know. So there were people who became household names in the UK at this time, and one of them was Dominic Cummings. So I don't know how much he travelled, but essentially he was caught out breaking a whole bunch of rules on COVID and then trying to justify himself in terms of his eyesight. And that really caused trust in government to plummet. And then, you know, so I don't know how much coverage there is of the Partygate, and I was okay, so okay, it goes out of the UK. So those kinds of things reduce trust in government much more than their policy measures. Yeah, so I think there was remarkably low trust in the Conservative government. You know, as proper minuses, and you know, real sort of like kind of stock, you know, like a stock surge, but very much to do with attention on their behaviour. It's actually, it was quite difficult. Actually, when I was at a workshop last week, the comparison was with opposition to government policy in places like Australia. You know, there were protests and, you know, anti-government measures. And I remember, I think in the UK, you had a degree of opposition to government policy, but it was like, it was just the right amount of, you know, because you don't want none and you don't want too much. It was kind of Goldilocks, is it? Is that the, yeah, there was a Goldilocks amount of opposition to government policy, but nothing compared to the, you know, focus on their behaviour.
Hello, thank you. My name's Mira and I work with Gabby. My question is a sort of mechanism question. So with the three things that came to mind. The first was a question about the mechanism of the scientific community. So you spoke also in your response to David's question about, let's say, the absence of diversity in the expertise that was being drawn on. And I wondered whether something like this, the mechanism of science advice, might be, from your knowledge of public policy, more and more institutionalized in terms of systematizing that diversity that they expect to see in their advice, not only in terms of expertise, but also in terms of, let's say, global representation, so expertise from different parts of the world that have had different experiences, and institutionalizing the role of their uncertainty in terms of, again, the question, how do we know in the middle of 2020 or in early 2020, the role of different lockdowns? That question on uncertainty connects to, you mentioned that there was a difference between ministers and advisors on their readiness to enter lockdowns and leave them. So whether they have different standards of what they consider as strong enough evidence to take a decision, and if you've seen a difference between them as to how ready they are to use that uncertainty and how they use that. And lastly, with all of that, with the last point or towards the end, when you mentioned that Boris Johnson in the fourth phase of COVID was no longer flanked by these experts and advisors, I wondered if there was a sense that in the public eye and in the government's eye, being flanked by experts and advisors signals crisis. And to leave them behind means we're now back to normal, so to speak. And whether you see going forward connected to this institutionalization of the system and the diversity of advice and the institutionalization of uncertainty, whether there might be a system going forward in which to see policymakers flanked by experts and advisors would not be such a crisis association.
Okay, yeah. So I think on the last thing, yeah, I think that's right. I think, yeah, it was very unusual to hold these press conferences with these experts, and the experts' role was to sort of update people on numbers and, you know, the patterns. Yeah, so I think they did think that quite early on. So they stopped having these press conferences, I think in 2020. You know, so it had been a while, and I think they were very much, they had that in mind. Yeah, so when it became less useful, more about crisis, yeah. In terms of the institutional side, it's one of those strange things. The UK, I think, had a very strong reputation internationally for having a very sophisticated, institutionalized mechanism for science advice before the pandemic. Then quickly, I think its reputation was shot. Yeah, so. But I think its reputation was based on the extent to which their advice giving was routine, and there were people in posts and they knew who to speak with, and the chief science advisor headed a unit within the cabinet office that then drew on routine advice. So I think that's what they had, and that's what they drew on. But it wasn't really geared up towards a pandemic. It was geared up towards helping other countries with the pandemic, or much smaller issues in which they would receive routine advice. So I think this is the first time when it was really put under stress. And a lot of the work before that or in the early part of the phase was to do with Public Health England was the organisation separately that was there to try and gather information on how many people had been infected and how many people had been tested and that sort of thing. And so I didn't talk about that much, but that's one of those things. Public Health England was to some extent the scapegoat for a lot of the science advice problems. Because the Secretary of State for Health, Matt Hancock, again, I don't know if is he well known, because he's become a celebrity. You know, he was on a TV program called "I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here." So I don't know. Yeah, I just have to check, you know, these things. But he's quickly become a laughingstock figure. But at the time, so actually, I went to a talk he gave to a private company, and he was very critical of Public Health England, and he said that they couldn't come up with information that he needed quickly. You know, how many people are infected, how many people will be infected later. So that form of science advice, I think he lost trust in very quickly, and looked to others to give him information. In terms of representation, I mean, I can go through this in more depth. But my impression of the development of SAGE, for example, was that it had to happen very quickly, and it was very ad hoc. You know, before then, they'd had these smaller, more routine bodies with a set number of people, a bit like, you know, just usual kind of advisory posts that you would have. You know, you appoint you for 3 years, you do a bit of work in non-crisis times. So my impression is that they recruited as many people as they could who are relevant to them in a small amount of time, and they drew on them as and when they needed. But I wouldn't say it was systematic, and you know, it was representative of certain people or certain professions. But I think there was no attempt to bring in. So, for example, I think there's a project I'm an advisor on ethics. You know, they didn't really draw routinely on ethical advisors, for example. They didn't really draw on cost benefit analysis, for example. So there was this great report by people at Layard. So there was Professor Layard, and there was sort of Gus O'Donnell, sort of former cabinet secretary, and they were trying to calculate the number of it was the well-being years. It was a bit like it used to be qualities, isn't it? But it was well-being years. At what point could you release the lockdown in terms of the balance of well-being? And they said it was something like August 2020 based on their parameters. And they said, you know, we're producing this report to encourage the government to do something like it, you know, to think about costs and benefits rather than do it themselves. And then they concluded, well, the government's not particularly interested in cost benefit. Okay, so in terms of their standards, so I haven't yet found, I'll need to go through, there's years of this stuff now, but I don't think within government there was a sophisticated algorithm that people would use that said, okay, if number of cases is this much, number of deaths is this much, we can do this thing. I think it was very much more ad hoc. And so I think their advisors were essentially saying to them at some point, we do not know what will happen when you release these measures. And so it's very hard to give you advice. The advice they did give at certain points was more about these, what do you call them, circuit breakers. They did advise 2 or 3 week lockdowns to manage cases in the autumn of 2020. And they did advise another lockdown towards the end of 2020. Now, that's where you could see a difference, because I think ministers in the UK government and the devolves did not want a lockdown over Christmas. So that's as unscientific as you can get, I think, you know. So they essentially said, you can, the advice was, I mean, it's a bit more formal than this, but it was essentially, if you really want to meet with your friends and family at Christmas, you can do so, but you shouldn't do so. And then as soon as it's over, we're going to lock down because cases are going to rocket again. And in fact, that is when the biggest number of illnesses and deaths happened, you know, just around that period. So obviously that was not a scientific process they were going through then.
Hello, Claire Fox from the Robert Schuman Centre. Thanks so much for the talk. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I think I would love to ask you to say a little bit more about what you understand of the dynamics behind the sort of the policy-making decision processes and how that might have varied across the different devolved governments, because we're sort of talking a lot in the aggregate, but I think it was very interesting that the UK decided not to use its potential emergency powers and centralize those decisions, but it actually gave devolved power to the different assemblies to make the decisions on when schools would close and the type of social distancing rules that were in place. And then related to that sort of devolved policymaking capacity, do you see, because you've spoken about reliance on the medical experts as a rhetorical device. You've spoken about ad hoc decision making. You've said that ministers, aren't actually as responsible as we might think in terms of making decisions at the end of the day. So what do you see as the particular dynamics? And many people felt this was an opportunity, for example, for the Scottish government to really sort of stand out on its own and distinguish its values in policy making. And I mean, what better time to distinguish your values when you're dealing with life and death and dealing with these sort of big questions of utilitarianism versus liberty versus rights versus well-being. So could you say a little bit more about the variation?
Yeah, okay. So, well, I think the division was between the devolveds were responsible for public health policy. So I think whenever it fell within that field, the assumption was that they would allow the delegation. Whereas the UK took control for it, also economic consequences and the coordination of the response. So they use this phrase, a four nations response to things. And I think so actually sometimes I interview Scottish Government civil servants and they do they use the phrase unironically, they do believe in it. And so essentially they all had separate responsibilities, but they all did the same thing at the same time at key moments. So they all locked down on March 23rd, 2020, essentially for the same amount of time. And the restrictions were almost identical. So the legislation was almost identical. It was just translated in different ways. And so the UK legislated for Wales and Northern Ireland as well. And it was only the Scottish Parliament to be able to do things differently. My impression is that this is the same with the usual UK involves. The Scottish and Welsh governments did things differently. I don't know. They're not minimal differences, but I don't think we'll look back and think that they were profound. So, for example, with masks, each devolved government had different timings and rules on masks, but you were talking about there was a week apart. And in fact, I think, I'd have to check, but I think from the outside, you'd probably think that the rules for England would be the least restrictive for the least amount of time. And the devolved would be more restrictive for longer because it was a UK Conservative government that was seen as, seeing a pandemic as an inconvenience. But I think in some cases, the devolveds were slower to have mask mandates than in England, or they didn't last for as long, or there were different periods. And so they were clearly all making their own decisions, but they were just as ad hoc in different ways. And there were things like at one point in May 2020, June, in some parts of the UK, you could go to a garden centre for plants, and in some places you couldn't. So it's that level of difference than something more profound.
So why do the West is similar?
I think generally, at least at the start, there was so much uncertainty that they didn't want to be experimenting. So I think they were very cautious. In fact, the information they were getting was largely centralized at the UK level. So there was the SAGE and the chief advisors were formally advising the UK government, but essentially they were advising all governments. And so they were the only ones that had the capacity. So I think the devolveds could make their own decisions based on advice from other people, but I think would be reluctant to do so because of their capacity issues. They also had a network of their 4 chief medical officers across the UK. And I think they were producing information and advice that was quite similar. So they were, there wasn't a big divergence of opinions. There were differences. I think the biggest difference that I think people noted in Scotland was the First Minister in Scotland was a better communicator of what they did. It wasn't that they were doing things differently, as they were communicating them more differently. So Nicola Sturgeon had daily press conferences where essentially she would speak for as long as people wanted. And she was a clear communicator. So that made a difference, but essentially they're communicating the same stuff better. So I think if you asked people in the Scottish government why they weren't so different, I think they would say, well, we can only do things differently to some extent because this comes down to the funding. So I think the Devolve said we would rather have lockdown for longer, backed by the economic furlough scheme to keep people paid while they weren't in work. But they said the UK government only maintains the furlough for when the lockdowns are happening in England. So they would have to fund their own lockdowns longer. And so they didn't have the money. So that would be their explanation. So they tried to do things a bit more, but that's the usual Scottish thing. We'll do things a little bit different for longer, but with the similar amount of funding. So you can only go so far.
Thank you very much. I'm Bert, so I'm a visiting fellow at the Schumann Center, and I'm very much interested in the citizens' reactions. But I wanted to ask you 2 questions. I found really interesting what you said about the insiders or our scientists. And I wanted to ask if that extends to being British scientists. And the second thing is you mentioned that the obviously the outsiders, but also the peripherals didn't really have much influence. But I just find it hard to believe, which is obviously not, it doesn't mean it's not true, but that there were no influences from what was happening abroad, from what was happening in other European countries, and also from what public opinion, more in the sense of actual behavior. So that might have been guided by some outsiders, because some of them, as you mentioned, were pretty prominent on TV and on social media. So of course, they would have not been influential in an official way. There wouldn't be a testament to, oh, we changed policy because so and so. But do you have a feeling if there was looking around in that sense?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So can I check, when you say British, do you mean so British approach or British nationality?
Sorry, British.
When you say are they British, do you mean is that like a British style?
No, nationality or living. So this studying citizens, I also find that in their understanding of experts, it often is my kind of experts, and this can extend to the opinions, the partisanship or representation of identity. So I was wondering if there was also that sort of, okay, we stay within our realm.
Yeah. So I think by and large, there was a small number of advisors became household names in the UK. And I think, it was Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, who were the sort of 2. There was also, for a while, the 2 deputy chief medical officers were quite prominent. Right, and their names are escaping me. But one was Jonathan Van Tam. So I don't know. He became quite famous just because he made sporting analogies for things in conferences. It was always about some obscure English football team doing well. So I forget what it was, but it was that sort of thing. In terms of influence from abroad, I think there was relative attention to US policy. So I think Anthony Fauci was a well-known figure. And I think probably the only other well-known person, I think if you were a specialist, was the advisor in Sweden, because that was an example of a kind of very prominent approach to doing things. In terms of influence from abroad, I think, and I'm trying to put it in order, I think probably the most influential experiences, I think the first one was Italy, because its pandemic happened first. And I think the criticism of the UK government is that it did not act quickly enough once it became clear that what was happening in Italy. Because there was a debate on how many weeks behind the UK were. Was it 2 or was it 4? And I think it was 2 and they thought it was 4. Then I think the next most influential comparison was with New Zealand because of their, again, very high profile, more preventive approach compared to the UK. But then I think the thing that interests me the most is that the ministers and their advisors often made reference to South Korea and China. And they essentially would say, we will not do what they did in South Korea or China. That is, so it was one part a liberal democratic argument, but it was one part a scientific one, a scientific prediction that if you are so repressive in the short term in the UK, then as soon as you release that, things will be worse. So they referred mostly to other countries to say what they wouldn't do rather than what they would do. I suppose the only other thing to say would be in terms of, I think there's a partial exception in terms of other advisors in terms of masks. So I think there was a lot of pressure on UK government to introduce mask mandates. And I think a lot of the pressure came from people who were not within our inner circle. And I think that did influence the advice that ministers got over time as things changed. But I think I'd imagine if you spoke with people who were very pro mask mandates based on preventive approach, I don't think they would say they were influential, because if they were influential, it would have been earlier and longer and more consistent over time, whereas it wasn't. It was very ad hoc and patchy and not really enforced. So I don't know if it was like that here, but there was a period of time when it was high enforcement of masks. But then there was a period of time that was wear them if you want. And as soon as you shifted to that language, most people stopped using them. So I don't think the scientists would think, okay, that was a success story for us. They would think that was the minimum.
Thanks. I have Ricardo. You and then, yeah, next one. Thank you.
Does it work? Yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. I try to be concise and brief because I have plenty of things I would like to ask you, maybe for later at a coffee. In the last slide, you mentioned something like the absence of an alternative. I wanted to ask you what it means, what you mean by alternative, if it is an alternative in terms of alternative to government, so a sort of a scientific alternative to government advice, or an alternative to specific measure, vaccines or health measure, and whether, for example, to explain the rise of the independence age, that me as a personal observer of the UK crisis, I consider as typical of the traditions of public understanding of science that fosters a scientific dissensus, pluralism, so to speak, and that I found really interesting. But I wanted to know whether you consider the independence age, you basically frame it as outsiders, if it can be considered part of this alternative that you mentioned that was lacking, on the contrary, and how do you explain the rise of the independence age? So if it is, let's say, part of this traditional pluralism, presence of organizational resources in the scientific field that makes that the higher resources you get, the more you can have a pluralism also in terms of scientific proposals. And I found also very interesting the typology you proposed of the variety of experts, and how basically, if you think that there could be, let's say, 3 typology of legitimacy that can explain or describe more carefully these typologies of experts. So one is the legitimacy on the media. So the more you are apt to act as an expert on the media, the more you will have a public centrality in the debate, because of course communication is a key issue during the pandemic. Is it a legitimacy that comes from positions in the let's say, a higher position in the scientific field? So it means the more I'm appreciated as a specific expert, I don't know, in epidemiology or whatever, the more I have a power or the capacity to be defined as a relevant expert, or the third one is, of course, the typology also that you propose in terms of distinctive aspect of civil servants, if it is a legitimacy that comes from the policy-making field. So the fact that you hold two positions, scientist and also civil servant. Stop here, but I would have 1,000 of things to ask, but maybe for later. Thank you very much for this talk.
Okay, in terms of independent sage, yeah. I suppose if the primary rules you followed were about science advice and your scientific principles, independent sage would make sense. Yeah, because it was the members were well known. Their communication was in public. They published all the documents, and they left a trail of how they made the decisions. So I think, yeah, that fits a lot of the principles of scientific practice and science advice. Yeah. So that's fine. So I think that is essentially what my argument comes down to, that if you want to act in the UK in this field, you essentially have two clear choices. One is to take that route of independent sage, which will guarantee your outsider status. And the other is to follow rules associated with UK government, which are almost the opposite of those principles, so that you can have influence within government. And I think for me, it's a clear choice. I think if I was seeking influence as an expert, I would know those are my two paths. I suppose it's an open question about, did the scientists involved know that the difference was so stark? Because I think you could think to yourself, well, surely if I'm attending these independent sage meetings, I'm disseminating all this important information on my social media, I'm pointing out to government when they're going wrong, surely they should pay attention to me and do what I say. I think that's probably like a reasonable mindset from people. But I think if I was speaking to them, I would say, no, you're pretty much guaranteed your outsider status there. Because, you know, I suppose it's a bit more like a club mentality. If you want to be in the club, you have to follow the rules associated with it. And one of them is, we will not trust you if you're going to go outside and talk to people about what we said. So I think that's maybe it's not as simple, but I think it is. Yeah, so in terms of legitimacy, so I think that people could, so actually this comes up more with the Italian comparison. I think people could see their motivation differently. They could say, so I didn't use this phrase, but I think my colleague uses the phrase star virologists. So they're high profile people. So I mean, I didn't know the names, I've got the names written down, but they are people who are sort of almost celebrity-like. And so they are motivated to become celebrity-like, that people will listen to them. And that will not necessarily mean they're influential within government directly, but maybe they'll have this indirect influence through public opinion or media attention or something like that. So I think, yeah, maybe that would be a strategic position that someone could do. They could become this alternative figure, putting pressure on. I'm struggling to think of anyone in the UK who performed that role effectively. So for example, I think well, almost everyone involved, I think, would reflect on how uninfluential they were compared to how influential they thought they should be. And so I think there are exceptions, like there's Professor Trish Greenhalgh, I think, who was very prominent on masks, who I would list as maybe an exception to the peripheral thing, because she would influence scientists who influenced the UK government. But I think if you were so invested in masks and the debate on masks, you would be dissatisfied with government policy. You might be satisfied a very short amount of time when they flipped to a place. But that would be it. Yeah. So it could be that people seek legitimacy in those terms you talk about, but I reckon some of them are essentially mutually exclusive rather than cumulative. Yeah, so there's an interesting question about what motivates people. Like if you work in a university and you're a senior professor in university, I think in some fields, people are still skeptical of their colleagues if they are too invested in government work. They would feel it kind of reduces their scientific credibility. So it could be that people could reasonably think my best bet professionally is maintain a position within my field first, then be available for media stuff, develop a social media profile as part of that, but don't go any further than that because you have to stay independent of government. So it could be that people are peripheral or outsiders for strategic reasons as well. You know, they prefer scientific, their notion of scientific credibility to their desire to be, directly influential in government. Especially since in the UK system, the people who are most influential in government are employed as civil servants. So it would be quite unusual for, I think, professors to suddenly go in and change minds, that sort of thing. And I think some can perform that role through SAGE, and they can do it relatively quietly and still maintain their professional credibility. So I think there are people like David Spiegelhalter. I don't know if he would be well known, but I think he would be a good example of someone who maintained this professional distance, contributed to SAGE, contributed to a lot of media work, but that was it. It was someone who was giving advice to people within the science advice mechanisms, but not really having huge expectations otherwise. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your very interesting lecture. My name is Vera Aksonova. I'm visiting fellow with STG and otherwise based at the University of Vienna. And I have sort of two questions, or a question/comment. The first one, and it goes in a way back to the announcement of this lecture, which suggested in a way to explore whether comparisons over time on COVID policymaking are valuable or just as valuable as comparisons of political regimes or systems. And my own research focuses on expert knowledge in times of crisis in non-democratic and hybrid political environments. And I was really struck when you were describing the expert features and specifically the rules of the game that were being followed in the UK, in the case of the UK, and you presented also something as very specific for the UK context. However, I recognized many of those rules of the games from soft authoritarian regimes that I'm focusing on. So the question is, what does it tell us about the UK system? And are the comparisons in a way, if we do sort of a cross regime comparison of how COVID was being dealt with and see what advice and how advice was delivered to policymakers, whether that comparison would not be to the benefit of the UK in the end or to other democratic systems. And my second question relates to one of the questions that you posed on one of the first slides. So why did some experts win and others lose? And I found it very interesting how you frame it, sort of winning and losing. Whereas for political actors, it is relatively clear how we can define that. For experts, it's not that straightforward. So I'm wondering what exactly you are talking about when you are talking about experts winning, meaning that their advice is being heard and followed, meaning that they become more insiders as opposed to being outsiders before, or how exactly can we define winning of experts? Thank you.
Yeah, okay. So the second question, I think that's the language that would come out of studies of interest groups, where it is more clear that to win is to influence policy and to lose is to not. So I just like the language, just for the rhetorical side of it. Yeah, it's I don't think the experts involved would talk about the win. It is, and I don't. So I think I think what the distinction really is between who is most listened to most frequently by ministers or something like that, and who feels most ignored most of the time. I think that would be the distinction, because I don't think the ones who are listened to the most would see themselves as influential. And in fact, I think one part of the sort of formal rules is that if they would be in trouble if they used that language in terms of their role is not to be influential, it is to give advice and information. So okay, so that's that one. Yeah, so I guess it's a rhetorical framing. The first question I think is interesting in terms of, I was at a workshop where someone was doing this review of authoritarian system policy advisory systems, And yes, he essentially, the language he came up with was the distinction between speaking truth to power and speaking power to truth. And, you know, in authoritarian systems, this was essentially policymakers telling scientists what they should tell them, that sort of thing. So I wonder about how we would describe the similarities and differences. I think certainly the similarities are that, again, in the UK, clearly ministers are in charge. Scientists are there to serve their purposes. Civil servants are there to serve the government of the day, that sort of thing. But I think the differences would be the consequences of what they did wrong. So if you don't follow the rules. So I think the worst that could happen to the chief science advisor would be that their term would end quicker, or they would retire more quickly, or they would be marginalized within a department, something like that. So I don't know how that would compare with the consequences in an authoritarian system, presumably much worse. I think the other difference would be at least people who are relatively outsider can freely criticize government with no consequences. And so, so it'd be those sorts of differences. There would be rules of interaction, but I think they'd be more to do with the rules to do with strategies and gaining trust. You know, if you wanted to be most trusted, then do these things rather than follow these rules or be punished. Yeah, so they're different. I think they're different. They're the same kind of rules, but different consequences. But it's interesting, when I was listening to his paper, he was comparing having to follow these rules, and therefore it wasn't evidence-based and objective. And I think that's an interesting comparison with authoritarian others. Do you want to compare authoritarian systems with an ideal type that doesn't exist anywhere, or with liberal democratic systems where, you know, it's not evidence-based, it's just less repressive? Okay, but I think that's a session on its own, isn't it? That comparison.
Max Crowley, I'm here for the semester from Penn State University. I direct the Evidence to Impact Collaborative there. So I have a bit of a use of research evidence kind of question in regard to this, the trend from the beginning of the pandemic in terms of maybe the visibility, maybe the actual reliance upon scientific advisors, to the end where it seems like they were, you know, there was distance and maybe the scientific advice wasn't being used as much. And so what are the implications of that? Is the implication that goes like beyond COVID or health policy in general, in terms of, are we seeing less sort of use of research, you know, in the UK government, but also in regards to your point around how much the reliance was really on the insider, right? The true kind of insider in this case, who was actually based within government. Have you seen the mix of who's inside change? You mentioned that didn't mean more outsiders came in to replace them while they were on the outside, but has that shuffled? Has that changed? As they're listened to less, they've, you know, left government to go do other things?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I think there have a lot of the former chief science advisors are still around. I think the problem is only one of them, Patrick Vallance, has had the experience during COVID, which is so different to the others. So one of his predecessors was David King, who set up Independence Age, and I think he hadn't had that experience of a crisis like this. But I think he was very critical. I was going to say implicitly, but I think he was quite critical of how Patrick Vallance performed as an advisor, because he thought he bought in too much to the UK government rules. So I think he wanted Patrick Vallance to be more of a challenge and to be more of a, you know, a kind of outward facing, you know, consider all the options kind of person. So I think there would be a comparison there in terms of what you could have styles of advisor in relation to the same rules. And I think maybe he would describe Vallance as relatively conservative, small c, compared to him. He would see himself more as a maverick type advisor. I think it might be the same with chief medical officers. I think in the past, the role of the chief medical officer in terms of influencing advice was to produce an annual report where they would raise a particular issue to focus on. So I think one of them was on, you see, so it's public health. So we have to do more about public health. So again, I think this is the only time when someone has been called upon so regularly on a day-to-day basis. So it's very hard to compare. I suppose the only thing to say is, I think the strategy that both of those people took was that it was essentially better to be trusted and in the room all the time, always relied upon, than to perform this maverick function where you felt good about your role, but you were less and less trusted for advice. And I think that's very much, I think that's coming out in terms of the, there was a big release of loads of WhatsApp messages recently. And I think that is the impression you get from the WhatsApp, apart from, you know, a lot of them are about how ridiculous some of them sound. But I think what it shows is routinely they had a mechanism to ask their two advisors anything they wanted in this closed space, which I think is probably where they're most influential, isn't it? They're helping them interpret information, and they're helping them come to conclusions themselves based on kind of sound reasoning. So I think that's what how they saw their role. But I suppose I don't get the impression that they reflected yet on what their role is. You know, they were just kind of acting like a sort of day-to-day process. The only other difference I think would be there was a chief nursing officer, and that is a much less prominent role within the system, but she was one of the people who was used to flank ministers during a particular time. In fact, she wore scrubs when she was on the TV for that purpose. But she was critical of how things were going, and you never saw her on these press conferences again. So I think the rules were quite clear in terms of, and Patrick Vallance was reported to have been rebuked on something for quite a mild challenge to what was going on. So I think they knew the consequences of what they do and the advantages of being quite small C conservative.
Does that mean that the evidence is stable? Does that mean that the evidence use has functionally been stable then? Because they've stayed, like, even though there was sort of a dip, but those people are still there. And so they sort of business as usual now, back to pre-COVID in terms of science use, or is it greater, less? Like,
sorry, it's hard to say. I think that's going to take a long time to work out. But I think this is, because evidence use is such a difficult thing to define, isn't it? Because it's a cognitive process, isn't it? You're thinking, well, they've got loads of stuff to read, but do they understand it and act on it? And does it change their beliefs or not? So I think their advisors helped them make sense of the information they were getting. So I think that was routinized. And I think the information they were getting from SAGE, that was routinized by trusted advisors. So I think that was sort of institutionalized, and that they met them regularly, or they could communicate with them regularly. And so I think, well, take away a crisis, there's probably that same mechanism in place, but it would occur to ministers less and less to speak to their advisors hourly or daily because they're not dealing with something like, you know, it's maybe the frequency that changes. Yeah, but it's difficult to say, isn't it? Because that's the least, it's the most difficult thing to assess through established research methods. Because ideally what you want to do is interview all the people involved and say, how often did you meet? What did you say to them? How did they respond? What changed? And that sort of thing. And that's the thing they're going to be least likely to talk about, just in general. So I was hoping for there's a public inquiry going on. I was hoping that a lot of them would have to be on record and go through in detail, like a sort of court proceedings. But I don't know. I think that's going. I don't think that's going to take as long as the Chilcot process, but I think it's going to take much longer than people hoped for. Yeah. So I think that might help. Yeah.
Thanks a lot so far. We have 5 minutes, and that gives me the opportunity to push you on the blank sheet at the end. Okay. The conclusions. So what we see, and what we also see from your work, that is very from the very intensive work and publications that you already have prepared on the UK and the COVID reaction. And I can only point at the book that you're currently preparing with Oxford University Press, summarizing all of your previous research. I'm really wondering how we can draw meaningful lessons to how we discuss evidence-informed policymaking. You hinted at that the European discourse is very much normative as a panacea for any type of dysfunctional policymaking, but it ignores what you very much and very intensively and rightly so, I think, underline is that the production and the use of evidence is embedded and is part of the political process itself. So we basically cannot neutralize that to say there's something as the chalice of truth that scientists bring to policymaking, and then they do their voodoo magic and policies are good. So how do we adapt our analytical lens on evidence-informed policymaking to pay tribute to the elements of power, of strategy, of status that interfere with the uptake of evidence in policymaking to ultimately improve the structures that we have? Is there any type of conclusion that you can draw from your analysis of the UK part?
Well, yeah,
Answer, tentatively answer.
I can already feel myself copping out here. I mean, I suppose it comes down to what it's the usual answer, isn't it? How you define improvement. So I suppose I see my role, I will just focus on the politics side. And since 2016, I've been able to give the same talk to, natural physical scientists, which is along the lines of, evidence is contested, stop thinking it will speak for itself, see this as a political process and see it as a necessary political process rather than pathologize what's going on. Because I think that's what, a lot of these events we used to go to, lots of scientists thought that politics was an inconvenience and that the political systems were pathological. So much better to be technocratic and to listen to experts. So I don't see any improvements along those lines. And I'm not too bothered about that because I don't think it is the role of scientists to make policy or to be too influential, or, they're not particularly, they don't have particularly privileged beliefs about, particular values and that sort of thing. So that seems okay. And in terms of learning lessons, the UK has funded lesson learning bodies, like through the Research Institute, they have bodies who are gathering information still on particular topics. And there's the classic academic center thing. They're expanding and growing to be, to take on a bigger role in that sort of field. So I'm sure there will be lots of publications produced on what happened and what scientists would like policymakers to learn about how to do better. But then I think what we know about the political use of research evidence is that most politicians are not going to read that stuff. And they're not going to be particularly bothered about what people are saying about it. So that would be my, I guess, usual thing, because usually I think what we're trying to explain is a minimal attention to a huge amount of evidence from outside. So I think that will continue. I mean, I wonder if the difference will be in terms of how much of a shock the pandemic was to the UK science advice mechanisms, given that they thought they were one of the best. And they can't think that anymore. I think, within government circles, they can't think that they were set up to deal with a crisis or that they performed well in terms of the structures they had. So I guess there'll be internal reflection on how to set up mechanisms to deal with another crisis better. But it's so hard to work out what that would be, because the whole thing about COVID was at the start, we don't know what it is. We don't know what it's going to do. We don't know what government should do as a result, so I think the next one will be so different, won't it? So it's very difficult to envisage a better process in relation to something like this. Yeah, I can't envisage it. I suppose maybe, so I mean, one thing that maybe you would think would be straightforward to improve would be, let's have more than one mechanism so that they can receive multiple sources of advice on the same thing, so that you're not getting into, you know, groupthink and restricted knowledge and so on. But that's such a tricky proposition to make within government, I think. Even if there weren't turf wars between the sources of advice, it's very difficult to imagine how that would operate in terms of how they would adjudicate as well. Yeah, I don't know. Can I say that? I don't know what will happen. I don't think they'll learn much. And it's actually quite hard to write a book when you know that's going to be the conclusion, isn't it? You know, because what will governments learn? Very little, I think. And I think probably the interesting thing is, from which countries will they learn? You know, will there be countries seen as successful or not? And, you know, I think for, you know, kind of routine commentators, probably maybe they would learn a lot of lessons from New Zealand, because they acted early and they had fewer deaths, and they had relatively high levels of public trust and that sort of thing. But I don't think the UK government would be particularly interested in New Zealand, because they'll say it's much smaller. They got lucky. They did things that we wouldn't do. They were too restrictive, you know. So I think there would be contested lessons, just like it is in other places. They won't learn. I think the UK is already feels vindicated with China, for example. You know, they say we won't learn from China, too suppressive. And I think a lot of the rhetoric now is that, okay, we're suddenly correct, given what's happened in China. So I guess governments learn the lessons they want to.
And if done rather on the policy outcome level than on the institutional setup for science advice.
Yeah.
In the medium term.
Yeah, and I think, I suppose now that there's I think you can either have an inquiry or you can learn, you know. So I think the UK has gone very much down the inquiry route. Yeah. So I think as soon as you do that, there's, you know, they'll be defensive. You know, ministers won't reflect. Yeah, they won't say, okay, well, I could have done this better, I could have done that better. So I think that's coming, and I think you see that with Boris Johnson just now. He is, all of his energies are in protecting his position. They're not about reflecting on where it went wrong. So, same with Matt Hancock. So I think by the time the inquiry is finished, all of the key decision makers will have been sort of discredited and irrelevant. And there'll be a new crop of people who will not have had the same experiences and won't really speak to them. Yeah, maybe.
The nice thing is we continue to follow your work to see how much of your work actually can inform the institutional redefinitions or restructuring for something that we indeed need to improve through science advice and policy making, which is the resilience of policy making of the political process. And this will take actually a broader approach than just looking at the institutionalization. That will include systems thinking also in the science advice bodies. So not only how, but what we define as science advice, and also the temporal dimension of how early on we invest in resilient structures rather than crisis reaction structures in terms of science advice. Paul, as always, I thank you so much. It was so interesting. Thank you for stopping by in Florence while you were here in Italy. As I said, please dive into Paul's research on the UK and on evidence-informed policymaking in general. It's very inspiring. And there's more to come, definitely, because he is a high output person in terms of quality and quantity. So thank you for today.